It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. It is the Take Command podcast. I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulsen. And today we are talking defense, our second of two positional rankings podcasts where we take the NFC East. We divide every team up into their position groups and then we rank them. The offense, if you missed it, was last week. It was great fun. It's a podcast. You can listen to it anytime, anywhere. That's the beauty of a podcast. Just like this one. You can do the same thing. So, Logan, when we look at the defenses in the NFC East, before we even get to the players, though, every single team in the division has a new defensive coordinator. So this is a bit of a guessing game for us because we don't know exactly how everyone's going to be deployed, not just here in Washington, where we've talked about that quite a bit throughout the spring, but literally every player on every team throughout the entire division is a bit of a mystery because they're getting coached and utilized by a new coach.
Yeah, and I think that's something, when I was doing my prep for this, I was kind of like, man, I could honestly see, let's just take defensive backs for rank. And I think if you look at last year, just as an example, Deron Bland, Stephon Diggs, Stephon Diggs, is that correct?
Trayvon Diggs.
Trayvon Diggs, yeah. They on paper are probably the best group, but they were also probably the best coached, and now that coaching staff is here in Washington, I could see there being some type of a flip because Zimmer, is a guy that on third down specifically gets really aggressive in man-to-man situations. Guys lose leverages, guys take chances, and, a group in Dallas that was characterized on taking chances and making explosive plays, all of a sudden, are they going to be allowed to do the same stuff they were prior? And I don't know is the answer. And so it's always really interesting to me how, it's something that I probably was a little bit of an oversight, early in my career as an analyst is just how important the scheme is and how important the coaching is. Because I really think Vic Fangio in Philly is one of the best defensive coordinators in the NFL. And, obviously that group's really talented. They underperformed last year, but a good coach can help maximize that group. And guys that look like they were maybe over the hill a little bit, Darius Slay slowing down, all of a sudden it's different because they're able to disguise stuff differently. They're able to get into different coverage structures, speak to skill sets differently. So I think, kind of dissimilar to the offensive rankings, this is going to be one that I think is, I'm going to put a big asterisk next to everything I'm going to say, because for me, it's kind of remains to be seen. You know what I'm saying? We can kind of evaluate the talent on the roster and say these guys are good football players, but ultimately, I think about Dexter Lawrence, just as another example in New York. One of the reasons he was so good is because Wink was able to do such a great job of getting him one-on-one with the center. And obviously Dexter's a great player, but his utilization is going to be completely different this year. So I'm, again, going through these rankings, going through the players, we can talk about them specifically more in a minute, but I cannot overstate how important the defensive landscape and how different it's going to be this year because of the new defensive coaches.
No doubt. And just as a reminder, so you got Vic Fangio in Philly, obviously Joe Witt Jr. Here in DC, Shane Bowen, who was in Tennessee the last couple of years. He is the guy in New York now. And then who am I missing? I said Philly. I said, Dallas has got Mike Zimmer. So that is what we got now. And we'll see how these, defenses get put together because there are a ton of really, really great defensive players in this division on all three levels. So Let's get into it. Let's start off with the defensive lines, which might be the strongest group in this entire division. You got all pro caliber players on literally every single one. Of course, in Dallas, you got DeMarcus Lawrence, Micah Parsons highlighting their group. Maybe some questions inside that we can get to. The Giants have Dexter Lawrence. They make the trade for Brian Burns this offseason. If we're going to count him, as kind of a three, they go 3-4. Do we count Burns and Thibodeau? I would as their pass rush unit. So you got those studs on the outside, especially when Thibodeau plays Washington. It's the Daniel Jones, but on defense. Obviously, we know what we have in Washington, the two Pro Bowlers inside and a bunch of questions on the outside, but solid players that are brought in. And then Philly's got, the trade for Bryce Huff. Josh Sweat's still around, but they lose Fletcher Cox. He retires. What are Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis as they continue to evolve? So talent all over the place, Logan. Any particular unit that you think stands out as the clear number one?
Yeah, I came into this kind of saying, it's going to be Philly all the way. But after kind of reviewing the depth charts and watching a little bit of film, I'm probably going to go with New York Giants here. I know that might be a little bit of a surprise, but like Brian Burns is a 10-plus sack guy. Kayvon Thibodeau's a 10-plus sack guy. And they've done it. They've proved they can do it. I think Dexter Lawrence also is a 10-plus sack guy. So having three guys at three different positions on that front that are very productive pass rushers. Dexter Lawrence was, for probably a 9-week period, the best defensive player in the NFL. And then obviously teams get wise. They start scheming him up. But he was more dominant last year for that 9-game stretch than Micah Parsons, Aaron Donald. Name your defensive player, he was the guy, and he still brings that level of talent each and every week. And we talked about how, with Shane Bowen's defense, that's going to be a little bit different, and is the utilization going to be the same? But then I look at Jordan Phillips too, who's again one of the best kind of larger interior run-stuffing players who also has a little bit of pass rush upside. You look at Azeez Ojulari, who's the backup to Kayvon Thibodeau. He had a 10-sack season, I want to say 3 years ago. He's been injured a little bit up and down there, but I think in terms of juice, in terms of production, you look at the backups. You look at Raheem Nunez-Roches. He's played a lot of football. He was a starter in Tampa Bay 3 years ago. Jordan Riley's maybe one of the biggest human beings in the NFL. He's 6'5", he's 340, and is a big run-stopping player. Like they just are. The top end's really good, and then the depth rotational pieces are also really good. And I think the difference between this group in Philly, at least in my estimation, is they've done it. I think everyone talks about Philly and Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter. And again, I think those guys don't get it twisted. I think they're tremendously talented football players. They just haven't strung a whole season together the way those other guys have. And I think that can't be overstated. Like, I could think you're the most talented guy. Like Jalen Carter was, my number one player in the draft whenever he came out. Like, he's an excellent football player. But he still hasn't kind of put it all together. We've seen flashes, and this year, him and Jordan Davis, the defensive coordinator Fangio, basically, I read an article getting ready for the show, basically saying if he's in shape, Jordan Davis, he's the best defensive player in the NFL. But is he going to be in shape? Is Jalen Carter going to be ready to go? Like, there's all these ifs with that group, and again, they're uber talented. I just think the consistency of the New York personnel, I'm going to lean that way, I think.
Well, it's something that for years we've kind of said they can take that kind of stuff in that room because they have Fletcher Cox, they have Brandon Graham. Cox retires, Graham's still around, but is the dynamic of that defensive line room different in Philly, where all of a sudden you're not getting the best out of Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis because the standard has dropped because Fletcher Cox isn't there? Like that's a TBD question. Leadership in general in that locker room with Jason Kelce retiring. And the year they had last year, kind of in the way they finished, you have to think upends everything.
Right.
So what does it look like? We'll ultimately see. But from a talent standpoint, talk about those two. Their teammate at Georgia, Nolan Smith, who ran 4.39 at the combine a couple years ago, and had some flashes last year. They bring in Devin White. Like they've got some guys behind them that they can make look really good. As we'll talk about with the linebackers as well. In terms of stopping the run, but as pass rushers, Bryce Huff, he's got pop. Sweat's got pop. Mm-hmm. So I think that Philly group still probably would get the slight lean from me, but I don't know. That's also probably I also just like look at New York and I'm like, the Giants stink, and I have to stop doing that because the reality is like, Thibodeau, if he can be more consistent, that's the thing. We say he's done it. He's been really inconsistent, but inconsistent that ends at 10 sacks means that there's some really high highs in there as well. Yeah. Lawrence is consistent. Burns is consistent. Yeah. And what does he do with more talent around him? Although he did play on a pretty good defensive line in Carolina, actually. I definitely think those are the top two. And I would even say I would put Dallas kind of in that group because Parsons is so dominant, and DeMarcus Lawrence is still good, even if he's on the back end. I tend to think that those three are kind of battling for one. And as talented as Washington's line is, and they might be the best coach potentially, with what we've seen from DQ over the years and what he does with defensive lines, I think Washington probably winds up coming in fourth here.
Yeah, and just to kind of double click on Philly, I think you get Bryce Huff in there, who is one of maybe the player I'm most excited to see kind of in the NFL, like in terms of an expanded role. He had the highest pass rush win percentage last year. He, higher than name your edge player, name your Myles Garrett's, your Nick Bosa's. Like his pass rush win rate was higher, but he's operating in such a small window. So you basically move on from Hassan Reddick, sign Bryce Huff, and does Bryce Huff with this larger role be productive? And I think that's the thing with Philly that I'm a little on the fence about is like, are they good football players? 100%. Are they uber talented? 100%. But like they haven't done it in their new roles. You know what I mean? They haven't been the guy yet. And I always kind of have to defer to like Dexter Lawrence has done it, and as much as I think Jordan Davis can be that guy, be that caliber of player, and Jalen Carter can be that caliber of player, like they just haven't done it with the consistency he's done it yet. And, Burns, we talked about, he, again, has played more football. He's been on the field more. He's done it kind of in this starting caliber role in Carolina. And Bryce Huff, while I think has a higher upside, hasn't done it yet. So I think that's kind of what I'm kind of banking on there. And Kayvon Thibodeau, like you said, is he better than Josh Sweat? I don't know. Josh Sweat's a pretty good player in my opinion. So it's really kind of like 6 in one, half dozen in the other. And I think the other thing that needs to be alluded to is I think Vic Fangio is a better, at least on paper, at least in my experience. And again, I don't want to maybe besmirch Shane Bowen like this because I think that defense in Tennessee was amazing. Yeah. It's just I think Vic Fangio's
for sure.
I think Vic Fangio is special. I think he's just a special talent as a coach.
I mean, he's the godfather of like what I would consider the modern NFL defense. Like I don't know. I mean, it's not like Kyle's too young for him to say, or for us to say like Vic Fangio is the Kyle of the defensive side of the football. But if you look at the dominant scheme around the NFL and like who's the guy, whose tree all the people come off of, Vic Fangio is the guy. Like there's probably more people running Vic Fangio defenses. It's not quite as proliferated around the league as maybe versions of Kyle's West Coast, but it's probably the heaviest usage defense. And certainly some of the principles of some of the man matching and different things that he's done that he really created along with his staffs in Chicago, in Denver over the years. So yeah, I mean he's different. There's a reason that he kept getting brought into Philly, to Miami, to these places over the past couple of years as a consultant, to be like, please, for the love of God, help our defense. And also, I think guys like Mike McDaniel wanted to learn from him to understand how they could scheme offense better against that defense. So, I think Fangio's right up there. I think that's the interesting thing, though, is like Bowen's defenses in Tennessee were awesome against the run and not very good against the pass. Part of that was an attempts thing. And how much do you then draw that back to the offense? And be like, yeah, they were terrible offensively for almost the entire time. So no kidding, they were not great against the pass. Teams just knew they could run it up real quick or just, get it up on the scoreboard. And then the Tennessee offense was going to have a shot at getting back. So they were willing to take a little bit more risk on that side of the ball. So I think it's interesting then you look at him, you look at what we don't know exactly what Joe Witt is, but if it's anything close to what he and DQ did together in Dallas in different roles, like that's a really strong group. And then Mike Zimmer was thought of as one of the best defensive coordinators in football and then took the head coaching job with the Vikings. And he's one of those like borderline head coach, amazing coordinator types. So who knows what he does in Dallas with that talent and in a very different style than what Dan Quinn did, or a different style at the very least than what Dan Quinn did with that same talent the last couple of years.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, maybe a better way to articulate that Giants-Philly debate, I think if I had to win now, I'd probably take the Giants. If I had to win over the next 3 years, I'd probably take Philly. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, and that's kind of like, I think a good way to characterize it. And I think I'm really glad you brought up Dallas as kind of in the mix. And again, they have, maybe the best defensive player in football, depending who you talk to, and Micah Parsons. I'm really curious to see how effective he is without Dan, and without that defensive structure and without that creativity in terms of usage. And again, I think Zimmer's a really smart guy. I think his third down pressure package, talk about kind of paving the way for the NFL. Like he's one of those cornerstone guys that I remember, watching him kind of work his like that AA look that, that was probably in 2011. And then everybody was running it by 2013 or 14. And so, again, he's had an impact very similar to Vic Fangio. But how has he evolved? How has he grown? What does his defense look like now? Does it still have that aggressive element to it? It'll be really fun to watch. But again, I think to your point, really smart guy. And again, Micah Parsons, Dexter Lawrence, I don't know if they have the depth. I think part of the reason is because that interior defensive line play over the last 2 years for Dallas has been so inconsistent. I don't feel great about it. I'd almost rate Washington ahead of them because their defensive interior is a little bit better, but I can't get past the Micah Parsons thing. Honestly, he's just such a dominant player. So
yeah. All right. So you would go New York, Philly, Dallas, Washington.
Yeah, and again, like the New York Philly thing's kind of 1A, 1B, but
yeah,
I think if I had to win this year, I'd probably go New York, I think.
Yeah, I think Washington's tough just because if all of a sudden one of these edge guys pops, and John and Duran have like revert to Pro Bowl form, like Washington could easily finish the season as the best one. I think that it's just hard. I think it's hard to think that that's going to happen considering the guys they brought in are vets. Like Dorrance Armstrong is a very, very good player, but there's not like a young unknown edge player that all of a sudden you're like, wow, that guy could break out. I guess the wild card would be like a Jamin Davis, right? Does Jamin all of a sudden become this stud pass rusher? And we count him as a defensive lineman by week 7, and that's changed the equation. That would kind of be Washington's path to the top. But certainly Washington's D-line should be a part, should be a part of a very solid defense top to bottom.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to note, like with the defensive line, Dorrance Armstrong specifically, like he was relatively productive in limited snaps last year. So what does he look like as, playing a little bit more? Like, can he get to that double-digit number? Obviously, the way you paid him, you probably think he can. And you think he brings good leadership and good diversity to the front. And then, like you said, does, Andre Jones or KJ Henry, do they find a way to get to 7 sacks, which would be great in terms of production? So there is a pathway. I just think there's more questions with Washington. And again, that's the whole point of this exercise, right? It's like there are, I think they all have good football players. I just think like with those top 2 teams, there's not a lot of questions. Then you get to Dallas and you say, well, that interior, while they have talented, like Mozzie Smith I really liked him coming out. He didn't play that way last year. Didn't play like a first-round draft pick last year.
No, not
but they still have 2 excellent guys on the edge. And you get to Washington, there's still more questions. John and Duran are coming off down years. I think that's probably coaching related and snap related in terms of playing too many snaps. But, it's all a little bit speculative in terms of can they bounce back to that level of production we're accustomed to. And I think they can. But I think that's why, you kind of, the more questions you are, the further you are down the list. So that's why Washington.
For sure. And, the young guy that could pop and change things, Johnny Newton, plays that on the interior as well. So we'll see, obviously, how he is.
And sorry, we're talking through it. I think another guy that we're going to talk about here in a second is Frankie Louvu.
Yep.
And he might be that guy that's the 8.5 to 11.5 sack guy this year. And again, that would really change the dynamic and the perception of this defense.
So that brings us to the linebackers, Logan. And ESPN.com's Mike Clay did his positional group rankings for the entire NFL last week. He had Washington's linebacker group as number 1, not just in the NFC East, but in the entire league. Oh, what a difference a year makes. Bobby Wagner, seriously. Frankie Louvu, obviously Jamin's still there for depth. Guys like Jordan McGee coming in, young guy. Do you agree with Mike that Washington has got the best, forget the whole league because that's not the podcast we're doing, but at the very least in the NFC East?
I definitely think the division for sure. I think when you look around the league, I think, there's names that pop up like Devin White. And again, I think if you watch, Devin White will make you a great highlight play. It'll make you a great highlight cut up. But I just think the consistency of his play is not always there. I think there's a reason he was one of the most blitzed linebackers in the NFL last year, and it's because you're trying to hide some of his deficiencies as a coverage player. And, when you watch Bobby Wagner, when you watch Frankie Louvu specifically, man, he is a special football player, or he was a special football player in Carolina. And that's why you pay him to come here, right? I think he's one of the better off-ball linebackers in the NFL. I think he gives you flexibility as a pass rusher. I think he gives you flexibility as a blitzer. And he's not the most dynamic coverage player, but he's got good instincts. And I think that's something like that is often underrated when it comes to linebacker play. So I think you get a guy You pair him with Bobby Wagner, who is probably a gold jacket guy when it's all said and done. Very instinctive, very smart, and you get this guy who physically can kind of do whatever you want him to do in Frankie Louvu. And I just think that's a really dangerous combination for the rest of the division in terms of linebacker play. And then Jordan McGee is a guy that I'm really excited about watching. Like, you love the coverage ability, you love the physicality, you love the instincts, like all the things. And so to get all three of those guys in the room, couple that with Jamin Davis, who, we're kind of still trying to figure out what exactly he's going to be in this defense. But I think those 3-4 guys make this room pretty special, pretty talented. And again, I know people are really excited about Bobby Wagner, but to me, it's Frankie Louvu is the guy that really sets this group apart.
Yeah, no, Louvu's got a chance to be special for sure. And that's exactly like you said, why you pay him and why you give him a long-term deal versus everyone else that pretty much got one-year deals. It's like, no, we know no matter what, this guy's going to be good. So if he's willing to sign up for 3 years of us, we are definitely willing to sign up for 3 years of him. With Wagner, though, I feel like there's some debate on what he is at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So what is he at this point? He led the NFL in tackles last year. So we know he can produce, but I remember years when like Zach Brown was here leading the NFL in tackles and you're like, yeah, but he's not actually good. He just runs to the ball, which there are worse things you can do with a linebacker. But when you just are, when you also leave open gaps and you don't cover at all, like the tackles can be not paint a complete picture. So as a coverage player, like, is Bobby Wagner still good? Is he still very good? Is he average? Is he a liability? Like, what is Bobby Wagner 2024 for the Washington Commanders at this point in his career?
I think Bobby Wagner's a good football player, and I think like what I mean by that is like he physically, I think there's been a little bit of a drop off. I mean, when you play as long as he has, like, that's inevitable. But I think the thing that makes him special is his instincts, right? And his understanding of technique and his understanding of offensive run scheme and his understanding of how the offense is trying to attack you, right? Like, watching his film, it's not overly sexy from Seattle last year, but dude is making every tackle. Dude's in the right position all the time. And as a linebacker, like, that's really, really hard to do in today's NFL because basically, like, everything is designed to manipulate the second level of the defense. And when I look at him, like, he just finds a way to be in the right spot. Now, he's not going to be, running sideline to sideline the way he used to. He's not going to blitz the way he used to. He still has it in the bag, but it's not quite as good. But he's still a very, very good football player. And I think when you look at the linebackers around the league and you look at just a certain level of consistency, like, you'd take him almost in every single room over one of the two guys that'll be starting there. And in some cases, both. Like in Philly, I think you probably take him over both. In Dallas, you might take him over both. Obviously, we'll talk about New York here in a second, but I think it's just the floor is so high with him. The ceiling isn't what it once was, but the floor is so high with him. You just I can't overstate how valuable that's going to be for this defense. And you pair that with a more explosive guy in Frankie Louvu, and I think you get a really nice pairing in terms of combination.
I think the other thing about Bobby is he elevates everyone around him. So D-line, other linebacker, safeties, corners, like, he's going to get you in the right play. He's going to make sure everyone's lined up. He's going to make sure people are alerted to the things that they need to be alerted to that they might not be thinking about themselves. I talked to Defoe about this in camp, and he's like, yeah, I was in the box playing like Buffalo, and Bobby's like, watch for this. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. So it's that kind of elevation of your entire defense, even if he himself is not what he once was, that I think makes Bobby Wagner so valuable to Washington, on top of all the stuff that you said of what he does still individually as a player. So Washington is one. The Giants have Bobby Okereke and Mike McFadden as their starters. They also have Isaiah Simmons floating around still, who they acquired from the Cardinals last year as kind of a utility piece. Washington or Dallas, I should say, has Damone Clark, Eric Kendricks, and then the rookie out of Notre Dame, if I'm remembering correctly, Maris Lufau. Philly has Nakobe Dean, Devin White, Oren Burks, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. So where do the rest of this, or where do the rest of these teams fall in terms of how you rank them?
I think for me, in terms of the next two, now I got to look at the depth of the New York Giants a little bit, but I think in terms of the next two, it's got to be the New York Giants. Like, Bobby Okereke is a special player. in terms of what they were asking him to do last year. He's long enough to take on offensive linemen. He's big enough to rush the passer. He's instinctive. He can cover. Like, I really like him as a player. Like, he's kind of in the same bucket to me as like Frankie Louvu, probably with more coverage upside and not as good of a blitzer. So like he's got kind of that special wow factor at the position, and I'd say he's for sure top 10, maybe top 7, top 8, something like that. So I think he's a really good football player, and I think, what's the other guy's name? McFadden. I think he's just in the right spot all the time, kind of in the same way you get with Bobby Wagner, but without the experience and the consistency. So I think they're both really good players, and I think they're a ton of fun to watch. You know what I mean? So, I think that's probably the second group for me.
Yeah, the depth. I think Simmons is such a wild card because they have the new DC. Like, what for a player that's kind of this hybrid safety linebacker, can blitz, can make plays in coverage, but maybe he isn't great at any of them, which I think has been the Isaiah Simmons experience. It's like he can do all this stuff, but does he do any of it well? But can Shane Bowen find a place for a guy who's a former top 10 pick, I believe, out of Clemson? So obviously a special athlete. For Philly, Nakobe Dean has always been like a huge question mark because I feel like people are waiting for it's his knees, right? His knees to blow up.
He's got a shoulder now, I think. He's basically got a lot going on.
Yeah, I think he's been an injury risk since he was drafted. Otherwise, if you drafted on the talent alone, a lot of people would have had him as a first rounder. Yeah. And he was not. And then Dallas linebacker is I don't know. Eric Kendricks was with Mike Zimmer forever in Minnesota, so they've got the familiarity piece. But how good still are they?
Yeah, I think Eric Kendricks is still a good football player, but again, is on the downside of his career. And I think when you look at, I think Philly, everyone kind of looks at the names, Nakobe Dean, Devin White. And like I said, I think Devin White's a little overrated. I don't think he's a bad football player. I think he's a little overrated. And I think that's why people look at that linebacker group and say, oh, they're maybe one of the better groups in the division. I'm not of that mindset really, because I think this, and we'll see, obviously with Fangio there, maybe he elevates, maybe he's a better football player, maybe they coach it differently, whatever that looks like. But I don't know. I think I'd probably lean ever so slightly to Dallas in this case. And it's really just kind of like what you prefer, and I think you could argue that the upside of Devin White is exciting, especially in a new environment. If Nakobe Dean's healthy, obviously he's like one of the smarter football players on that roster. So like all those things are really good. But, he hasn't done it. He's been banged up. Nakobe Dean has. And Devin White has been inconsistent, especially last year was very inconsistent. So I would just say, like, kind of depends on what you're preferring. I think you get more consistent with Kendricks. Clark, I'm not super familiar with, but was good in the role he was in last year with Dallas. And I think I would just probably bet on the floor there a little bit, you know what I'm saying, as opposed to the ceiling that you get with Philly. But again, the depth at linebacker for Philly is a little bit gnarly. And I really like Maurice Lufau for Dallas. So I just would probably lean to Dallas. I think they've just got the floor's a little bit higher. The ceiling might not be as high, but I'm going to bet on floor. Kendricks is a guy who's done it. Clark was very, very solid last year. And I think Maurice Lufau has enough athletic ability and length to be something special potentially. So I'd say they're 3 for me.
Yeah, it's also interesting, these positions wind up merging as well, the hybrid stuff. Like if we were to add in Defoe or Jeremy Chin or some of these other hybrid safety linebackers to the discussion, same thing in Dallas, how does that change the conversation? And then, they don't operate independently either. I think that is the one area where if I was going to make an argument for Philly, I think the job of being a linebacker in Philly is probably easier because you have Jalen Carter and those guys in front of you. And, especially as run defenders, you're just a cleaner. Like if I'm Devin White and I get to play behind Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter, I'm like sick. I'm going to have 180 tackles. If you're playing behind the interior in Dallas, you're probably going to wind up with a guard on you with a little bit more frequency. So I think that's like again, we're trying to do it as independently, like who are the players that we're talking about, not how are they going to play within or too much reliant upon the structure and scheme around them. But that is just something that I think when it comes to the actual football in the fall, that is worth pointing out.
Yeah. No, and again, one of the reasons you're so confident and to this point in, Bobby Wagner and Louvu is that they're in a defense that I think is going to maximize what they do, and again, like there's a little bit of a question mark with some of those other groups. And again, I mentioned how excited I am about Bobby Okereke and McFadden, up in New York, because I think that schematically it fits kind of what they do well. Having watched Shane Bowen's defense last year in Tennessee, but again, like Devin White, he was in the Todd Bowles defense in Tampa Bay. They're blitzing him all the time. He's not going to do that with the same level of frequency in Philly. Dallas, I think both those guys are smart guys, and just watching their usage pattern last year, I think it lends itself to what Zimmer wants to be or what he wanted to be previously. And again, this defense might look completely different. Who knows? But I think that's, again, just to kind of point that out, like schematically, we're assuming certain things, but we don't know until we see him actually play games, especially with the linebacker position. It's so challenging. And DBs, which we'll talk about in a minute. So,
in fact, we'll talk about them right now. The cornerbacks in this division, Logan, we'll kind of split cornerbacks and safeties a bit, but we can ultimately do a DB ranking at the end of this. But corner in this division is pretty interesting because you have a lot of high variance players. Deron Bland, Trayvon Diggs in Dallas, high variance players. The Giants have some guys, obviously young guy like Deonte Banks who had his moments last year, both good and bad. We have no idea what to think in Washington. And Philly, they get Kenyon Mitchell in the draft. He's a rookie. We think he's going to be pretty good, but we have no idea. And then Slay and Bradbury are guys that have been some of the best corners in football, but last year looked like that might have been the end of their rope as elite, maybe even good players. So giant shrug emoji. I don't know what to do with the cornerbacks in this division.
Yeah, neither do I. Honestly, like I was going through it and I was like, you can kind of talk yourself, this is not what I'm saying, but you could talk yourself into the fact that like because of scheme, Washington will have the best defensive back group in the NFL. Like you could just say like the scheme's going to elevate this group. They're going to be the best. But like, again, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but that scheme is leaving Dallas. Like one of the things that made those guys so effective is the fact they were able to take shots. They were able to be aggressive. I mentioned this at the top of the show. Zimmer's going to make those guys play a little bit more man-to-man coverage. They're going to play a little bit more zero. They're going to play a lot more, I think, probably single high safety. And I don't know if they're going to be as aggressive, and then if their production wanes, everyone talks about this with Diggs all the time. Like he without the interception production, is he as good of a player because he gives up a ton of yards because he's taking chances all the time? I don't know. So this group is extremely challenging to kind of parse out and figure out what's going on. You mentioned Philly already. Like I think that's a great point. They have new, young, talented people coming in, but they haven't done it yet. And the old guys that were there, I don't think were being elevated by scheme, because talk about a very simplistic scheme that's very easy for offenses to identify and attack, putting those guys in bad spots. Slay, I think, still has some left in the tank. There's talks from their OTA period about Bradbury moving to safety potentially. Like, who knows? But they're trying to figure it out. So, again, this group is really, really tough to kind of figure out what's going on. So I'd probably give the edge, if I had to Dallas, just because they've done it, because they've shown guys that can play and understand some of the nuance of the position. But I'm so reluctant to kind of definitively stamp that, because I think that the scheme change for them is going to be very, very impactful in terms of their production overall.
Yeah, I mean the Giants, they just feels like they've been trying to figure out corner forever.
Yeah,
they always have one guy you're like, oh, that guy's pretty good, and then the rest of them you're like, I never heard of this guy. And that's just been a kind of the Giants' existence, which seems like for years. Cordell Flott listed as the other corner right now. Drew Phillips, Aaron Robinson on down the list. And then, I mean, Washington's so interesting too, because, as we'll talk about as we kind of merge the conversation with the safeties, like Sainer still, young guy, but feel like he's going to be pretty good in the nickel. But what do you count Quan as? Is he
probably
a safety? Is he?
I think.
Yeah, I would probably list him as a safety. But he's going to wind up playing in the nickel some. Is like a Buffalo nickel. But also, like
what you said too, I think one of the things about Joe Witt's defense is that you have, what'd you say? You have 18 starters on defense. And I think in the secondary,
he said that.
Yeah, but we're quoting what he said, right? And I think when you look at it, you're like, oh, you're probably going to get him in the nickel. You're probably going to get Chin in the nickel at some point. You're going to get probably Percy or Forrest in the post at some point. Like, there's a lot of different pieces. And I think that's encouraging because I think you've got a bunch of talented physical football players. You want to get them on the field, especially in the back end. So, I mean, I think Washington will be better because I think their talent's good, but I think they'll be better because the coaching's going to be better and because how they're using these guys will be better. That's why I want to push them up the list. But after last year, that seems kind of silly to do because it was a rough year for the defense.
All right, so before we make a ranking, let's talk about the safeties, and then we can try to do because the corners, if we try to rank them, is just like question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. Okay, cool. Yeah. Do safeties help us out at all? Obviously, Washington has a tremendous rotation of guys that I think we feel solid about.
Yeah.
Butler, Chin, Forrest, Dominique Hampton, whose name we haven't brought up yet, Quan. The way they looked in training camp, you feel pretty solid. Mm-hmm. Dallas has got some good guys. Donovan Wilson, Malik Hooker, especially when Hooker's been healthy. He's had some really productive stretches of football. Philly, they got Reed Blankenship back. They have C.J. Gardner-Johnson back. They drafted Cooper DeJean. So, we obviously don't know what that's going to look like. And then Tyler Nubin, draft pick for the Giants, Jalen Mills, Jason Pinnock. So they've got some names that we've heard of for a variety of reasons. Have played some ball. So does the safety rotations amongst these four teams help us separate these DB groups at all?
I mean, kind of. I think Dallas would probably get the edge there, and I think if you pair them with the DB group, they probably get the edge in defensive backfield, right? Because I think the safeties, they've done it. They're physical. They all have different skill sets. They might not have the highest ceiling of the whole group, but I think that's the group that you feel the most confident about because they've played a lot of football. When you look at Philly, that's an interesting group because they've got, Brown tore his ACL. He was playing good football for him. You mentioned Blankenship and C.J. Gardner-Johnson are back. They're good football players that have done it, and I think you feel very confident about them. But I think I don't feel they don't make me as excited in terms of like what they can do from a diversity standpoint of play as the guys in Dallas. I really, really like the safeties here, and I would probably put this group ahead of Philly because I think I am just so high on Quan right now. I think he's going to be a very special player in this defense. I think when you watch, I had to do a breakdown with Coach Quinn for the Command Center show. And when I was watching his plays, especially in the second half of the year, I was like, this dude is a baller. Like, he's physical, he's instinctive, he's fast, he can play man coverage. And he was doing that basically kind of on his own. And I just think like with the new defensive staff there, they're going to be better. And I look at Jeremy Chin, not from last year, but from the year prior. And I'm like, this dude was almost a defensive player of the year candidate or 2 years ago, whatever that was. And I'm just like, man, like having both these guys here with that kind of coaching gets you excited. And I have to acknowledge a bias there because it's like I've seen them. I've watched them more than any other of these players, but I would probably say that's the second group to me because, again, I think that duo could be pretty special in the back end. You know what I mean? So I'd probably lean that way for the safeties. I'd probably go Dallas, Washington, Philly, and then I think I would probably have the Giants, they're fourth for me because Tyler Nubin's going to be starting, and I love Tyler Nubin coming out, but he's a rookie, and rookie defensive backs tend not to have a great first year, so we'll see moving forward.
Yeah, which also is a huge, if we kind of zoom back out to all DBs, like is a huge thing for Philly, right?
Yeah.
Like if all of a sudden Kenyon Mitchell comes in and has like a Sauce Gardner rookie year, well, that changes the equation. If Cooper DeJean is like an impact player, he's all over the place, he's like the second coming of the Honey Badger and he's making plays, he's at nickel, he's at safety, he's lining up at corner, like he's doing everything. Yeah, Philly's gonna have the best DB group in the league. They have two guys that some people had as like top 10, top 15 type talents on their boards in the draft coming in, but they're rookies, and the chances that's going to happen, especially in year one in a Vic Fangio defense, it's kind of complicated. You have to learn all the man matching rules and the zone matching rules, and who knows how fast those guys pick it up. That's like there's just I think that's the thing is like Philly and Washington especially. The potential range of outcomes is top 5 DB group in the league to we have major problems and we're in a bad spot. And that I think is pretty fascinating because obviously like you look at Washington, this could be a fast physical group where Emmanuel Forbes like unlocks his playmaking potential and he's got 8 picks and St. Juice figures out how to make plays on the ball and he's got 6 picks. The safeties are all over the place. You never know who's on the field. You never know. Like offense, it's just going to be an offensive nightmare. it also could be none of those guys are that good, and this is year one of a rebuild, and that becomes very apparent by week 6. So that range of outcomes, I think, makes this so difficult when we haven't seen it. And it goes back to the what we started everything, which is all these coaches are new. You have no concept of where anyone's going to be and just how well things are going to mesh and meld.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think the other thing that needs to be kind of observed here is the offenses and what position these defenses will be in. Like, I'm pretty confident Dallas is going to have good offense, and that'll make their defense better. You know what I mean? Because they'll be playing with a lead. They can be more aggressive. They can, blitz more. They can work on their pressure packages. Micah Parsons is going to do his thing. It's going to deleverage the defensive backs, right? And then you look at Washington, I think they're going to be in a lot of close games, right? The defense is going to be leveraged. I think if you're looking at how they've constructed the team in year one, they want to lean heavily on the defense. And I think they're going to be put in tougher situations earlier on, right? Philly, like, maybe the biggest question mark for the defense is Jalen Hurts, right? Mm-hmm. Like, can he get back to what he was at the beginning of last year or the year prior? Because if he can't, they're going to be leveraged to the hilt. And all these young guys are going to be put in hard, complex football situations for 4 quarters, which is not what you want to do. And you look at good defenses, usually they're paired with good offenses because they can kind of force you into one-dimensional spaces, and then they can kind of take advantage of that. And so, again, I think like that's something to consider. I think Dallas's defensive backs might be better because offenses are going to have to throw on them more. And then those guys can get their hands on footballs and get turnovers, right? While here in Washington, maybe you're in closer games. Maybe there's less opportunities to pick the football off. So I think it's also, as much as it is like looking at the defensive coordinators, it's also, what kind of offense is supporting the defense and what is the role of the defense on the team. And I think, again, that also applies to New York. I think that defense on paper, after kind of going through this exercise, could be pretty gosh darn good. I mean, obviously the back end's got to come together. They've got, obviously Banks back there, but, like a lot of other question marks, but they're going to be in a lot of close football games. And that usually stresses the defense, and they're not as effective as teams like, I think back to the Atlanta Falcons when they won the Super Bowl. That was one of the best defenses in the NFL when Dan Quinn was calling the defense there. Or they lost the Super Bowl to the Patriots, excuse me.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons they were so effective is because they were always playing with a lead. And they had forced teams to be one-dimensional, and they were able to maximize playmakers. And then the following year, Kyle leaves, the offense isn't as good, the defense is leveraged a little bit differently, and they're not as effective. So I think that's another thing to consider when looking at these defensive rankings is, especially by position, is who's supporting them offensively.
Yeah, poor Shane Bowen. He's in Tennessee.
Yeah.
You have Derrick Henry. It's like, this is great. All of a sudden, the offense goes down the hill. Then you get your next DC offer, and you're like, all right, Daniel Jones. Whew, buddy. So, yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting year in the NFC East. Then again, they're always interesting years in the NFC East. All right, that is our show for today. We got one more for you this week, and we'll be with you twice a week all summer long. And then ultimately, once we get back into the season, like probably the regular season, we will be back with you 3 times a week. But 2 times a week during the off season, you're home for everything Commanders. We got some fun stuff planned, try to get some interviews, some guests over the next couple of weeks. So it'll be a good time here on Take Command. So that's why you should subscribe. And if you like what we do, then tell a friend that they should subscribe as well. Don't be selfish. It's very rude. For Logan Paulson, I'm Craig Hoffman, and we'll see you next time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.